Imagine a sun-scorched desert stretching endlessly under a brilliant sky, where the wind whispers stories of centuries past. It was in this harsh and unforgiving landscape, in the western deserts of Libya, that a boy named Muammar Gaddafi was born around 1941. His family belonged to the Bedouin community, living a life defined by simplicity, resilience, and survival. Their world was far removed from the bustling cities and global politics of the time, yet the echoes of history, foreign invasions, colonial ambitions, and centuries of struggle shaped the environment into which he was born. From an early age, Gaddafi witnessed the harsh realities of life. His father, a humble herder of goats and camels, worked tirelessly under the relentless desert sun, and his mother nurtured the family amidst scarcity and hardship. Life was not easy, but it instilled in young Gaddafi a deep understanding of endurance and self-reliance. The desert was both a home and a teacher, offering lessons in survival, observation, and the value of community. It was here, amid sand dunes and tribal tradition, that the seeds of his future ambitions quietly began to take root. Beyond the immediate struggles of daily life, Libya itself had been a land marked by turmoil. Foreign powers had long sought to control its territory, and the legacy of invasions, most recently by European colonizers, was ever present. The local people lived under political and economic pressures imposed by outsiders, while traditional ways of life persisted stubbornly in villages and desert communities. For a young boy, these contrasts between oppression and resilience left a lasting impression. The stories he heard, the events he observed, and the injustices endured by his people planted in him a consciousness that would later fuel his ambitions on a national and even international stage. Even as a child, Gaddafi was curious about the world beyond his immediate surroundings. He listened intently to the radios that brought distant news and ideas into his desert home. Voices from Cairo, speaking of Arab unity and resistance to foreign influence, captivated him. He absorbed these messages, not as mere entertainment, but as sparks of possibility, proof that the lives of ordinary people could intersect with the broader currents of history. The combination of personal hardship and awareness of larger political struggles would shape his identity in ways few could anticipate. This story of a boy growing up in a desolate desert village is more than a tale of one individual. It is a glimpse into the forces that mold leaders, the early experiences that shape ambition, and the environment that tests resilience. As we journey through the life of Muammar Gaddafi, we will see how these humble beginnings, intertwined with historical upheavals and ideological awakenings, set the stage for a remarkable and controversial chapter in Libya's history. If you find this story intriguing, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the full journey of Gaddafi's rise, his rule, and the dramatic events that followed. Stay with us as we uncover the layers of history and the human stories behind the headlines. As the desert winds continued to shape the early years of young Muammar Gaddafi, the wider world around him was a place of tension, domination, and cultural upheaval. Libya, the land that stretched from the arid sands to the Mediterranean coast, had long been a crossroads of civilizations, each leaving traces of conquest and rule. Yet, in the first half of the 20th century, the most immediate and transformative force for the Libyan people was the Italian colonization, a period that would leave deep scars on the nation's identity and sow seeds of resentment that would grow for generations. While Gaddafi's childhood was grounded in the intimate rhythms of Bedouin life, herding goats, listening to the desert winds, and observing the routines of his family, the presence of foreign rulers loomed over the broader landscape, shaping the political and cultural context in which he would eventually emerge as a leader. The Italian authorities arrived with a firm intention to reshape Libya in their own image, both physically and ideologically. Coastal cities were fortified, administrative systems were established under strict Italian oversight, and local communities were gradually brought under a governance that left little room for self-determination. For many Libyans, the colonial presence was not just a matter of foreign soldiers walking the streets. It was a pervasive force that seeped into schools, markets, and even homes. Education was one of the first arenas of transformation, with Italian curricula replacing traditional teachings, emphasizing the language, history, and worldview of the colonizers. Local literature, long a repository of Arab and Berber traditions, was suppressed or outright banned, replaced by textbooks that glorified European conquest and marginalized indigenous voices to the people of Libya, whose families had lived on these lands for centuries. This was more than an inconvenience, it was an affront to their identity, an attempt to erase the stories, language, and customs that bound them to their homeland. At the same time, the Italian administration exercised strict control over political life, ensuring that local voices could not challenge their authority. Participation in governance was limited to those who were deemed compliant, and even then, their power was largely symbolic. Decisions were made in distant offices or imposed by foreign officials, leaving ordinary Libyans with little agency over the affairs that directly impacted their lives. Tribes that had previously negotiated autonomy or exercised influence over local matters found themselves increasingly sidelined, their leaders co-opted or removed. For a young Gaddafi, growing up in the shadow of such structures, the contrast between the resilience of his family and the impotence of local governance was stark and instructive. He witnessed firsthand how a nation could be rich in culture and history, yet rendered vulnerable by the imposition of outside authority, and how ordinary people could be made to feel powerless in the face of foreign control. Beyond the suppression of culture and political marginalization, the colonization also brought economic pressures that deepened social divides and fueled discontent. Italian investments were concentrated on projects that primarily benefited the colonizers, such as the development of ports, urban infrastructure, and commercial enterprises that relied on imported labor or resources, leaving many local communities to struggle with inadequate access to basic services and livelihoods. Wealth and opportunity flowed in a manner that accentuated inequality, highlighting the disparities between those aligned with colonial interests and those living on the periphery of the new social order. This environment of economic stratification, coupled with the erosion of cultural and political autonomy, created fertile ground for growing resentment among Libyans, who increasingly viewed their circumstances as the result of both external oppression and the failure of traditional authorities to resist it. Within this charged atmosphere, the seeds of political consciousness began to take root in Gaddafi and his peers. The injustices they observed: the displacement of traditional governance, the suppression of Arab and Islamic identity, the privileging of foreigners over locals, did not exist in isolation. They were part of a broader story of a nation struggling to define itself amidst the pressures of imperial ambition and modern political forces. Gaddafi's exposure to these realities during his formative years instilled a sense of urgency and purpose. The radio broadcasts from Cairo, carrying messages of Arab unity and anti-colonial sentiment, resonated with him precisely because they addressed the grievances he saw in his own country: the loss of autonomy, the erosion of cultural pride, and the deep inequalities imposed by foreign rulers. These broadcasts became a lifeline, connecting the young Libyan to ideas and movements that offered a vision of self-determination and empowerment, a stark contrast to the constraints imposed by the Italian administration. The tension between daily life in the desert and the pressures of a colonized nation created a rich backdrop against which Gaddafi's ambitions would later unfold. He understood that leadership was not merely about personal strength or charisma. It was about navigating complex social and political landscapes, interpreting the desires and frustrations of a people, and channeling those energies into action. The experiences of growing up under the shadow of colonization, observing the suppression of cultural expression, and witnessing the limitations imposed on political participation were formative in shaping his worldview. They were lessons in power, control, resistance, and the potential for change, laying the foundation for the revolutionary ideals that would define his early political life and ultimately propel him to the forefront of Libyan history. By connecting these early experiences of hardship, cultural suppression, and political marginalization, we begin to see the contours of a story that is both personal and national, a tale of a boy in the desert and a nation struggling for identity. This period of Italian colonization was more than historical context, it was the crucible in which Gaddafi's awareness of injustice, his political ambitions, and his determination to challenge the status quo were forged. Understanding this chapter is essential to grasping the motivations, choices, and ultimate trajectory of one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. As Muammar Gaddafi grew older amidst the harsh landscapes of Libya and the lingering shadows of Italian colonization, his understanding of the world expanded far beyond the boundaries of his desert home. The struggles he observed of communities stripped of political power, of traditions suppressed, and of ordinary people constrained under the weight of foreign influence found resonance in voices that traveled across the airwaves, carried by the invisible waves of the radio. Among these voices, one stood out above all others, cutting through the static of distant transmissions with a force and clarity that would leave a lasting imprint on the young Gaddafi. The voice of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic and formidable leader of Egypt. Nasser's speeches and broadcasts, filled with rhetoric of Arab unity, independence from colonial powers, and the empowerment of ordinary citizens, were more than words to Gaddafi. They were a blueprint for possibility, a demonstration that determined leadership could reshape nations and challenge entrenched powers. Through the simple act of tuning in to Cairo's radio stations, Gaddafi was exposed to ideas that would crystallize his emerging worldview. Nasser's pan-Arabist ideology, advocating for solidarity among Arab nations and the rejection of foreign dominance, provided a framework for understanding the frustrations and aspirations he had witnessed at home. The Italian authorities had attempted to instill a sense of inferiority and dependency, suppressing Libyan history and imposing foreign values. Yet Nasser's message countered that narrative entirely, offering a vision of dignity, strength, and self-determination. Each broadcast reinforced the notion that political and social change was not only desirable but achievable, and that leaders could mobilize the collective will of their people to resist external control. For Gaddafi, the radio became a window into a broader Arab world, one in which struggles for sovereignty, identity, and justice were interconnected across borders, and one in which youthful energy could be harnessed to challenge entrenched hierarchies. The influence of Nasser extended beyond politics into the personal and emotional dimensions of Gaddafi's life. He admired not only the boldness of Nasser's reforms, but also the audacity with which he confronted the West, rejecting colonial interference and asserting Egypt's independence on the global stage. This sense of defiance resonated deeply with Gaddafi, whose formative years had been marked by the humiliation of his country under foreign rule, and the frustration of seeing local leaders, unable or unwilling to defend Libyan interests. Nasser's example suggested that leadership required vision, courage, and a willingness to act decisively, even in the face of powerful adversaries. The radio programs, rich with impassioned calls for Arab unity and resistance to imperialism, became a source of inspiration, shaping Gaddafi's ambitions and planting the seeds of a revolutionary mindset that would later define his political career. The ideas he absorbed were not abstract theories, but practical lessons embedded in narratives of triumph, struggle, and reform. Nasser's initiatives in land redistribution, industrialization, and nationalization of resources illustrated the transformative power of state intervention when guided by ideology and public will. These policies demonstrated that leadership could reshape society, realign economic priorities, and assert independence in ways that resonated with the needs of the people. Gaddafi internalized these lessons, seeing in them a potential model for Libya, a society that could assert its identity, reclaim control over its resources, and challenge the dominance of foreign powers. The admiration was not passive. It ignited a proactive desire to organize, to mobilize, and to envision a future in which Libya, like Egypt under Nasser, could stand proudly among nations, independent and self-determined. Gaddafi's engagement with Nasser's broadcasts also fostered a sense of connection with a broader Arab identity, transcending the local grievances of his own desert village. The idea of Pan-Arabism, the belief that the nations of the Arab world shared a common history, culture, and destiny, resonated strongly with his experiences of Italian suppression and the fragmentation of Libyan society. Listening to Nasser, Gaddafi began to see the struggles of his people as part of a larger regional narrative, a continuum in which resistance to colonialism and advocacy for social justice were intertwined across borders. This perspective nurtured an ideological foundation that would later guide his revolutionary activities, offering a sense of purpose that extended beyond national concerns to a vision of regional transformation. It was a perspective that combined the immediacy of Libya's challenges with a broader historical and cultural consciousness, providing him with both motivation and justification for the ambitions he would pursue. Even in his teenage years, the integration of Nasserist ideas into his worldview was evident in Gaddafi's early political engagements. He and his peers formed secret committees and discussion groups, debating strategies and envisioning ways to challenge the monarchy and mobilize public sentiment. The principles he had absorbed, the centrality of unity, the rejection of foreign dominance, and the potential for decisive leadership permeated these discussions, shaping not only the content of their plans, but also the confidence with which they approached them. Nasser's example offered proof that change was possible, that the entrenched structures of power could be confronted, and that committed leadership could transform abstract ideals into tangible political action. For Gaddafi, these lessons were not merely theoretical. They were a call to action, a directive to organize, plan, and ultimately to lead. Thus, the influence of Nasser through the simple medium of radio broadcasts was profound, providing Gaddafi with ideological clarity, strategic inspiration, and a vision for what leadership could achieve. It linked the personal experience of a boy in the Libyan desert with the broader currents of Arab nationalism, anti-colonial struggle, and regional transformation. The seeds planted during these formative years would grow into the revolutionary zeal that defined Gaddafi's early political career, shaping the ambitions, strategies, and ideological convictions that would propel him to challenge the existing order and reshape Libya in ways that echoed far beyond its borders. The desert, the suppression of local culture, and the inspiring voices from afar converged to form a vision, a mission, and a path that would define one of the most complex and consequential figures of modern history. By the time Muammar Gaddafi reached his teenage years, the seeds of ambition that had been planted in the harsh deserts of Libya, nourished by the injustices of colonization and the electrifying messages of Pan-Arabism, began to sprout into concrete action. The youthful curiosity and ideological fervor that had been cultivated through radio broadcasts and the vivid stories of his people's resilience now demanded a channel, a means through which he could translate thought into action and frustration into tangible change. Surrounded by the stark realities of rural life, where his family and neighbors struggled under the enduring legacies of Italian colonization and the perceived weakness of the monarchy, Gaddafi began to see a path forward, a vision in which the people of Libya could reclaim agency over their destiny. And he quickly recognized that the military might serve as the most effective vehicle to achieve this transformation. in the privacy of desert homes and secluded meeting spots, away from the watchful eyes of local authorities and colonial remnants. Gaddafi and a small circle of like-minded peers began to organize. These were not casual conversations or idle dreams of rebellion. They were meticulously planned gatherings, secret committees dedicated to studying political theory, learning from the successes and failures of other nations, and preparing strategies to challenge the entrenched structures of power embodied by King Idris and his government. The discussions spanned a range of topics, from the principles of governance and the philosophy of leadership to tactical approaches for mobilizing support within the armed forces. Each meeting served as both an educational forum and a laboratory for revolutionary thought, a place where ideas could be tested, debated, and refined without the immediate threat of reprisal, though the stakes were ever present and the consequences of failure understood by all participants. The choice to focus on the military as the instrument of change was both practical and symbolic. Libya, at the time, was a nation fragmented by regional loyalties and tribal affiliations, where civilian efforts to organize meaningful resistance faced immense obstacles due to surveillance, suppression, and the inertia of traditional governance. In contrast, the army offered a disciplined, centralized structure, trained personnel, and access to resources that could tip the balance of power in favor of those determined to alter the status quo. Gaddafi, ever observant and strategic, recognized that winning the support of the armed forces could provide not only the means to execute a coup, but also the legitimacy needed to assert authority in the aftermath. Within the context of his committees, the military was more than a tool, it was the embodiment of possibility, a tangible mechanism through which his vision for Libya could begin to materialize. These formative efforts were imbued with a sense of urgency and purpose that reflected the intensity of Gaddafi's convictions. Each member of the committees understood the delicate balance between secrecy and action, knowing that even the smallest misstep could lead to discovery, punishment, or death. The discussions, often held late into the night or in remote locations, were infused with a combination of youthful daring and disciplined analysis. They studied historical revolutions, dissecting the strategies of leaders who had successfully mobilized forces against entrenched powers, extracting lessons that could be adapted to the Libyan context. At the same time, they remained acutely aware of the risks. King Idris' government, while often seen as ineffective, still possessed loyal factions within the military and the bureaucracy, and any premature action could jeopardize the lives of those involved. Gaddafi's ability to balance audacity with caution became a hallmark of his early revolutionary approach, demonstrating a strategic foresight that would define his later political maneuvers. The committees also became a crucible for developing Gaddafi's leadership skills. Within these small, tight-knit groups, he honed his ability to inspire, persuade, and organize others, learning to navigate interpersonal dynamics while maintaining focus on the larger objective. He encouraged debate and critical thinking, fostering an environment where members could challenge ideas and refine tactics. Yet he also cultivated loyalty and a shared sense of purpose, ensuring that his vision remained coherent and unified. The process of building these committees was, in many, a rehearsal for the larger political theater that would later unfold, allowing Gaddafi to test both his ideological convictions and his capacity to lead others under pressure. As the committees matured, their activities expanded beyond theoretical discussions. Members began to identify potential allies within the military, quietly recruiting individuals whose loyalty to the monarchy was weak or whose discontent with the status quo aligned with the revolutionary vision. Supplies were noted, logistics were considered, and the earliest outlines of operational plans began to take shape. Gaddafi's understanding of timing, coordination, and influence within hierarchical structures deepened, and the teenage leader increasingly saw himself not merely as a participant in a movement, but as the architect of a transformative initiative. The combination of ideological grounding, practical strategy, and personal charisma positioned him to navigate the complexities of a society in flux, bridging the gap between aspiration and execution. Within this environment of secrecy and ambition, Gaddafi's worldview, already shaped by the harsh realities of the desert and the ideological inspiration of figures like Nasser, found its first concrete expression. The formation of these committees was more than an act of youthful rebellion. It was the crystallization of a vision in which Libya could assert its independence, reclaim its dignity, and redefine its place in a rapidly changing world. Each meeting, each recruitment effort, and each strategic discussion represented a step toward the realization of a revolutionary potential that would soon challenge the monarchy in ways that few could have anticipated. The teenage Gaddafi, drawing from the lessons of history, the injustices he had witnessed, and the ideological currents sweeping through the Arab world, began to move from contemplation to action, laying the groundwork for a transformation that would reverberate across Libya and beyond. By the end of this period, it was clear that these early efforts were not mere youthful fantasies. They were the foundation of a calculated, persistent, and ideologically driven movement. The secret committees, the careful cultivation of allies within the military, and the meticulous study of political and tactical strategies coalesced into a form of organization capable of executing change. Gaddafi's vision of using the military as a vehicle to overthrow King Idris and reshape Libya was no longer abstract. It had become a tangible plan, anchored in careful preparation, strategic foresight, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of revolution. In this crucible of secrecy, ambition, and intellectual rigor, the young man who had grown up in the deserts of western Libya began to emerge as a figure whose influence and actions would soon redefine the destiny of a nation. When Muammar Gaddafi took the decisive step of enrolling in the Bazi military academy, it was more than a mere pursuit of formal education. It was a strategic maneuver that allowed him to merge ideology with opportunity, theory with practical application, and personal ambition with collective action. The academy became a crucible where the young revolutionary could cultivate allies, refine his understanding of military structures, and begin to perceive the broader possibilities for enacting the dramatic societal changes he had long envisioned. Within the rigid routines and disciplined environment of the academy, Gaddafi discovered not only the technical skills of soldiering, but also the subtler arts of leadership, persuasion, and organization, learning how to navigate hierarchies and inspire loyalty in those around him, all while carefully shielding his revolutionary ambitions from the scrutiny of superiors who might have dismissed or punished such audacity. In the classrooms and training fields, Gaddafi's mind was constantly active, absorbing lessons not merely in tactics and strategy but in the mechanics of influence and control. He recognized that the army, as an institution, offered a unique combination of authority, discipline, and access to resources, making it a powerful vehicle for social and political transformation. He began to identify peers who shared his dissatisfaction with the monarchy, quietly testing their receptiveness to revolutionary ideas, and cultivating a network of confidants who would later become critical to the planning and execution of the coup. The bonds formed in these formative years were not incidental. They were deliberately nurtured, as Gaddafi understood that ideological alignment alone was insufficient without trust, loyalty, and the ability to act cohesively in moments of crisis. Each interaction, each conversation, and each subtle assessment of character contributed to a growing web of potential collaborators, all anchored by the unifying vision of an independent, assertive Libya free from the perceived manipulation of foreign powers. Beyond the walls of the academy, Gaddafi sought to broaden his horizons and deepen his understanding of the world, recognizing that his revolutionary ambitions required exposure to international contexts and the tools of modern governance and communication. His travels to countries such as Turkey and the United Kingdom provided him with first-hand insights into Western societies, technologies, and methods of organization, and these experiences profoundly influenced his developing worldview. While he observed the efficiencies and advancements of Western institutions, he simultaneously sharpened his critique of what he perceived as moral and cultural decay, exploitation, and imperialist tendencies, strengthening his anti-Western ideology. These journeys reinforced his belief that Libya's path to sovereignty and dignity could not be dependent on foreign models or intervention, but must be forged through indigenous leadership, self-determination, and the disciplined mobilization of the Libyan people and military. During this period, Gaddafi also began to integrate the revolutionary ideals that had inspired him as a child, particularly the pan-Arabist and anti-imperialist principles he had absorbed from Nasser's broadcasts, into a coherent strategy for political action. The academy provided a controlled environment in which he could test these ideas against the realities of military organization and discipline, refining his understanding of how ideological conviction could be translated into practical steps for mobilization and eventual governance. His ability to blend strategic thinking with ideological commitment became increasingly evident, as he demonstrated not only the capacity to inspire loyalty but also the foresight to anticipate challenges, mitigate risks, and plan for contingencies. The combination of rigorous military training, ideological clarity, and careful cultivation of allies positioned him uniquely to act decisively when the moment for revolutionary action arrived. Gaddafi's studies abroad also exposed him to advanced communication techniques and organizational methods that would later prove critical in consolidating power and controlling narratives. He observed how information could be leveraged to influence perception, shape public opinion, and coordinate complex operations, lessons that he internalized with the intent of applying them to Libya's context. The exposure to foreign systems, paradoxically, reinforced his commitment to creating a distinct path for Libya, one that rejected dependency on Western powers while adopting pragmatic strategies to strengthen internal cohesion and project authority. In this way, his experiences at the academy and overseas were mutually reinforcing. The formal military education provided the structure and discipline necessary to act effectively, while the exposure to international ideas sharpened his ideological convictions and expanded his tactical repertoire. Within the academy itself, the seeds of a tightly knit revolutionary network began to bear fruit. Gaddafi's peers, once merely companions in study and training, became collaborators in a clandestine effort to prepare for the eventual overthrow of King Idris. Each recruitment was a careful exercise in judgment, as he sought individuals who possessed not only loyalty but also initiative, discretion, and a shared vision of an empowered, self-determined Libya. These early alliances were formative, teaching Gaddafi the nuances of leadership under pressure, the importance of strategic patience, and the delicate balance between ideological purity and operational pragmatism. The military, once a symbol of order and hierarchy, became a laboratory for revolutionary experimentation, a space where Gaddafi could align doctrine with action, ambition with discipline, and strategy with ideology. As the years at Bazi Military Academy progressed, Gaddafi's vision for Libya crystallized. He no longer merely aspired to challenge the monarchy. He began to conceptualize a comprehensive transformation of Libyan society, one that would integrate political, social, and economic reforms guided by the principles of Arab nationalism, socialism, and Islam as he interpreted them. The combination of military preparedness, ideological grounding, and strategic networking provided him with a unique platform from which to launch a coup, ensuring that when the decisive moment arrived, he would not only possess the motivation but also the tools, allies, and tactical understanding required to seize and consolidate power effectively. The academy had become more than a school. It was the incubator of a revolutionary leader, shaping the mindset, skills, and alliances that would define the trajectory of Libya for decades to come. In this critical phase of Gaddafi's life, the interplay between his military training, ideological education, and international exposure created a fertile environment for revolutionary thought to evolve into actionable strategy. The discipline and hierarchy of the academy, the practical lessons from his travels abroad, and the careful cultivation of trusted allies converged to form a blueprint for political action that was both bold and methodical. By the time he graduated, Gaddafi was not merely a young man with ideals. He was a meticulously prepared revolutionary, capable of translating his anti-Western and pan-Arabist convictions into a tangible plan for altering the course of his nation. The foundations laid during this period would prove instrumental in the unfolding drama of Libya's mid-20th century history, setting the stage for the audacious and controversial path that Gaddafi would pursue in the years to come. By the late 1960s, Muammar Gaddafi had spent years meticulously preparing for the moment that would define his emergence as the central figure in Libya's political transformation, blending his military training, ideological vision, and carefully cultivated network of allies into a plan capable of overturning decades of entrenched monarchy. The kingdom of Libya under King Idris was fragile, fractured by regional loyalties, inefficient governance, and the growing perception among citizens that corruption had taken root at every level, often exacerbated by Western influence that seemed to prioritize foreign interests over the well-being of Libyans themselves. In this environment of frustration and stagnation, Gaddafi recognized both opportunity and necessity, understanding that the moment for decisive action had arrived, and that success would depend not only on careful coordination, but also on his ability to mobilize public sentiment and exploit the vulnerabilities of the ruling class. The coup was not executed in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of clandestine planning and disciplined preparation. Gaddafi and his inner circle had worked to infiltrate and recruit sympathetic figures within the military, understanding that the loyalty of armed forces was a critical determinant of success. These recruits were not mere soldiers. They were allies who shared a vision of a Libya liberated from external control and internal corruption, trained and briefed to act with precision when the signal was given. The revolutionary cells, which had begun in the secretive committee meetings of his youth, now coalesced into coordinated units with the capability to secure key installations, communication channels, and strategic points across the country. Timing and coordination were paramount, as the divided nature of the monarchy meant that any misstep could provoke loyalist resistance and derail the operation entirely. Gaddafi's strategy capitalized on the widespread dissatisfaction that permeated Libyan society. Many citizens, especially younger and more politically aware individuals, had grown wary of the perceived inefficiency and subservience of the monarchy to Western powers, particularly in the allocation of Libya's emerging oil wealth, which seemed to benefit foreign companies and a small elite while leaving the majority impoverished. This frustration created a latent energy that Gaddafi skillfully tapped into, presenting the coup not merely as a military maneuver, but as a popular movement aligned with the hopes and grievances of ordinary Libyans. Through careful propaganda, targeted outreach, and the cultivation of a narrative that emphasized liberation, justice, and the restoration of national dignity, Gaddafi framed the revolution as a collective aspiration rather than the ambition of a single man. Even as he remained the architect and leader of the operation, The execution of the coup demonstrated Gaddafi's blend of audacity and tactical acumen. Key government offices, military barracks, and communication networks were seized with surprising efficiency, often encountering minimal resistance, which reflected both the lack of cohesion within the monarchy and the careful planning of the revolutionary forces. Errors occurred, as they inevitably do in operations of such complexity, with some units misdirected and officials temporarily escaping capture. Yet these missteps were mitigated by the overwhelming disarray of the divided government. King Idris himself was away from the capital at the time, a circumstance that Gaddafi's forces leveraged to secure a rapid consolidation of power before any organized loyalist response could be mounted. The swiftness of the operation not only minimized bloodshed but also projected an image of inevitability and competence that reinforced the perception of the revolution as both legitimate and unstoppable. Once the initial seizure of power was complete, Gaddafi moved quickly to consolidate authority, understanding that a vacuum could invite chaos or counter-revolutionary action. His first steps involved securing loyalty among key military units, appointing trusted confidants to critical positions, and establishing mechanisms to monitor and control political activity throughout the country. Public perception was carefully managed, emphasizing the overthrow of a corrupt and compromised monarchy while framing the revolution as a vehicle for social justice. National sovereignty and economic reform. Gaddafi's ability to combine military precision with political messaging allowed him to transform what could have been a fragile and contested coup into a durable regime change, garnering both domestic support and cautious attention from international observers. The public's reaction played a crucial role in the revolution's success. Ordinary Libyans, long frustrated by the monarchy's failures and the visible influence of foreign powers in domestic affairs, largely welcomed the change, at least initially, perceiving in Gaddafi and his allies the promise of a more responsive and autonomous government. Streets that had been quiet with resignation erupted with cautious celebration as news of the king's deposition spread, signaling a moment of collective catharsis and the first tangible sense of empowerment for citizens who had long been marginalized in political decision-making. This popular energy provided not only legitimacy but also practical support, as many individuals assisted in logistical and communication efforts, ensuring the rapid stabilization of the new revolutionary authority. International reactions were a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and cautious observation. Leaders across the Arab world, particularly those sympathetic to pan-Arabist ideals, were intrigued by the audacity and success of Gaddafi's movement, while Western governments, accustomed to engaging with the previous monarchy, were forced to recalibrate their diplomatic strategies in response to a regime that projected both unpredictability and assertive nationalistic ideology. The coup's success highlighted the interplay between internal discontent and strategic opportunity, demonstrating how a determined and ideologically driven movement, when carefully planned and executed, could exploit structural weaknesses and popular grievances to achieve transformative change. In the aftermath of the coup, Gaddafi faced the dual challenges of consolidating power and translating revolutionary ideals into a functioning governance model. While the monarchy had fallen, the task of restructuring Libyan society along lines that reflected his vision of Arab nationalism, anti-imperialism, and social reform was immense. The overthrow of King Idris represented the first and most dramatic act of revolution, but it was only the beginning of a longer, more complex process of shaping Libya into a state that aligned with Gaddafi's ideological and strategic ambitions. The initial success of the coup, however, cemented his position as the dominant political actor in Libya, providing both the authority and momentum necessary to pursue a comprehensive transformation of the nation's political, social, and economic landscape. The story of Gaddafi's rise through the overthrow of King Idris thus encapsulates a convergence of preparation, opportunity, and public sentiment. It illustrates how a deeply committed, strategically minded individual can leverage structural vulnerabilities. Societal frustration and disciplined organization to enact dramatic change, transforming both the governance of a nation and the perception of possibility among its people. The events of that period laid the foundation for the decades of Gaddafi's rule, reflecting the interplay between ideology, ambition, and the pragmatic execution of revolutionary strategy, and serving as a defining moment in the complex history of Libya's modern political landscape. Once Gaddafi had successfully seized power, the challenges of consolidating authority and transforming Libya according to his revolutionary vision quickly became apparent, and he moved with a combination of boldness, meticulous planning, and ideological zeal to ensure that the nascent regime would not only survive, but also fundamentally reshape the political and social fabric of the country. Understanding that fragmented loyalty and lingering allegiance to the monarchy could undermine his authority, Gaddafi implemented a series of strict laws aimed at eliminating political pluralism and suppressing any form of organized opposition. Recognizing that the survival of his revolution depended on the unchallenged dominance of his ideology, among the most consequential of these measures was a sweeping ban on political parties, codified into law, which effectively dismantled pre-existing political structures and prevented the formation of competing organizations that could mobilize resistance or challenge his control. By removing the formal mechanisms through which political dissent could be organized, Gaddafi not only centralized power but also sent a clear signal to the population that the new order was uncompromising and non-negotiable, positioning himself as the sole arbiter of Libya's political future. Simultaneously, he orchestrated a systematic purge of opposition figures, targeting not only former members of the monarchy and their allies, but also those within the revolutionary movement whose loyalty was in doubt or whose vision diverged from his own. This purge was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating that deviation from Gaddafi's interpretation of revolutionary principles would not be tolerated and reinforcing the perception of invulnerability around the leadership. Individuals who had once been comrades in planning or operation were scrutinized, marginalized, or removed entirely from positions of influence, creating a climate in which loyalty was continuously tested and adherence to the regime's ideology was paramount. The purges were not merely acts of suppression, but also instruments of social and political engineering, designed to reshape Libya's power structures, instill discipline, and cultivate a culture in which dissent became dangerous, if not fatal. To enforce the new ideological order across the nation, Gaddafi established revolutionary committees, a novel mechanism that extended the reach of the regime into every corner of Libyan society. These committees, composed of dedicated supporters and fervent adherents to his vision, were tasked with monitoring communities, schools, workplaces, and public institutions, ensuring that the values of the revolution were both taught and observed. The committees acted as both educators and enforcers, blending propaganda with surveillance to inculcate loyalty and conformity, and often taking direct action against those deemed to resist or undermine the ideological program. Universities, for instance, became centers of intense revolutionary activity, with student organizations mobilized to identify dissent, report nonconformity, and even publicly denounce peers and faculty who were perceived as threats to the ideological purity of the state. The presence of these committees was pervasive, creating an atmosphere in which private opinion and public behavior were continuously monitored and aligned with the dictates of the revolutionary leadership, effectively turning everyday life into a site of political and ideological engagement. The laws and committees introduced by Gaddafi were not static. They evolved to meet the perceived challenges of maintaining absolute control over a diverse and historically fragmented nation. In towns and villages across Libya, committees were instructed to organize local populations, oversee economic and social activities, and ensure that all public discourse reflected the revolutionary values promoted by the state. Leaders of these committees reported directly to Gaddafi and his inner circle, creating a chain of accountability that bypassed traditional bureaucratic structures and reinforced personal loyalty to the revolutionary leadership. The reach of these committees extended into almost every aspect of Libyan life, from education to commerce, and even into religious instruction, with Gaddafi emphasizing a synthesis of Arab nationalism, socialism, and his interpretation of Islamic principles. This integration of ideological enforcement into daily life was both ambitious and intrusive, fundamentally reshaping the relationship between the individual, the community, and the state, and establishing mechanisms of control that would endure for decades. Public response to these measures was complex. While some citizens were inspired or mobilized by the revolutionary rhetoric and the promises of a new social order, others experienced fear, uncertainty, and dislocation as traditional avenues for political participation were eliminated. The revolutionary committees, in particular, became instruments of both education and intimidation, ensuring that conformity was not simply encouraged but required, and that deviation could carry severe consequences. By controlling both the political structures and the mechanisms of societal influence, Gaddafi created a system in which ideology and enforcement were inseparable, embedding the principles of his revolution into the operational fabric of the state, while simultaneously neutralizing threats to his authority. The result was a tightly controlled political landscape, where the combination of legal prohibition, purges, and committee oversight produced both stability and pervasive control, consolidating Gaddafi's position as the unchallenged leader of Libya. The impact of these policies extended beyond immediate political control. By eliminating opposition and enforcing ideological conformity, Gaddafi was able to implement broader social and economic reforms that reflected his revolutionary vision. From the redistribution of wealth to initiatives in education and public administration. At the same time, the climate of surveillance and ideological scrutiny shaped the social psychology of Libyans, creating an environment in which loyalty and participation were measured against the standards set by the revolutionary committees. This dual function enforcing ideological adherence while facilitating the implementation of revolutionary policies demonstrated Gaddafi's understanding of the interplay between caution, persuasion, and governance, and highlighted his capacity to transform abstract ideological goals into concrete administrative and social structures. Through the combination of strict legal frameworks, purges of opposition, and revolutionary committees, Gaddafi effectively secured the dominance of his ideology and established a model of governance that centralized power in his hands while embedding his vision into the everyday lives of Libyans. The measures reflected not only a desire for political control, but also a comprehensive approach to shaping society in accordance with revolutionary principles, illustrating how an individual leader could leverage law, organization, and social mechanisms to consolidate authority, suppress dissent, and create a pervasive system of ideological enforcement that would define Libya's political landscape for decades to come. Following the consolidation of his political authority, Gaddafi turned his attention to reshaping Libyan society according to his vision, seeking to combine ideological ambition with practical reform in a way that would reflect both his revolutionary principles and his interpretation of Islamic values. Central to this vision was a unique synthesis of socialism and religion, a framework that aimed to challenge the entrenched inequalities left by colonial legacies and the monarchy while presenting a moral and spiritual justification for state intervention in economic and social life. Gaddafi believed that by intertwining these principles, he could engineer a society that was both economically equitable and culturally authentic. promoting social cohesion while resisting Western influence. Yet the ambitious scale of these reforms would soon reveal the limits of centralized planning and the complexities inherent in transforming an entire nation. Gaddafi's social programs initially carried the promise of empowerment, targeting disparities in wealth, education, and access to resources. Rural areas, historically neglected under both Italian colonial administration and the monarchy, were a particular focus, as Gaddafi sought to extend public services, infrastructure, and education to communities that had long been marginalized. At the same time, the redistribution of wealth from Libya's nascent oil industry was intended to demonstrate the benefits of his socialist policies. Providing subsidies, housing, and social support that were meant to improve living standards and reduce the gap between urban elites and rural populations. This ambitious agenda was accompanied by ideological education campaigns, often administered through the revolutionary committees that had been established to enforce political loyalty, with citizens encouraged or compelled to adopt the values of Arab nationalism, Islam, and socialism in tandem. However, the lofty goals of social transformation were met with practical challenges that would undermine their effectiveness and, in some cases, exacerbate the very problems they were meant to solve. The combination of centralized control, ideological enforcement, and limited administrative capacity frequently led to mismanagement of resources, inefficiencies in distribution, and widespread bureaucratic waste. Water and agricultural systems, for example, were heavily exploited in attempts to increase production, resulting in environmental strain and long-term degradation of arable land. Similarly, industrial and infrastructure projects often suffered from poor planning and lack of expertise, with ambitious construction initiatives failing to meet their intended outcomes and consuming substantial public funds in the process. While the rhetoric of social justice and equitable development remained compelling, the lived reality for many Libyans increasingly involved scarcity, uncertainty, and frustration with a system that seemed, in practice, more focused on ideology than practical results. The implementation of these policies also reflected Gaddafi's tendency to centralize authority and make unilateral decisions, often marginalizing local expertise and bypassing established administrative structures. Committees and local administrators were expected to execute programs in strict adherence to revolutionary directives, sometimes with little regard for local conditions or economic realities. This top-down approach reinforced control but often undermined efficiency and responsiveness, creating tensions between the goals of the revolution and the practicalities of governance. Citizens, particularly those in urban centers, began to experience the dissonance between Gaddafi's vision of societal transformation and the hardships of daily life. As inflation, limited access to goods, and frozen salaries contrasted sharply with promises of prosperity and empowerment. Despite these difficulties, Gaddafi's ideological framework continued to provide a unifying narrative for his supporters, blending anti-imperialism with Arab nationalism and Islamic principles in a way that framed social and economic reform as part of a moral and spiritual mission. Schools and universities became key sites for instilling these values, with curricula emphasizing the revolution's principles, the importance of community responsibility, and the rejection of Western influence. The integration of religious and socialist rhetoric served not only to legitimize state intervention in daily life, but also to cultivate a sense of purpose and shared identity among citizens, reinforcing the perception that hardships were temporary sacrifices in the service of a greater national project. Yet the consequences of economic mismanagement became increasingly visible by the 1980s, as the ambitious social programs strained the state's resources and failed to deliver the widespread prosperity promised in the revolutionary rhetoric. Public services, once touted as transformative, suffered from underfunding and inefficiency, while rural and urban communities alike struggled with the uneven application of development projects. Gaddafi's insistence on ideological conformity and centralized planning often limited the ability of local authorities to innovate or respond to pressing needs, further compounding the hardships experienced by ordinary citizens. At the same time, the regime's control over economic activity, including restrictions on private enterprise and trade, stifled initiative and limited opportunities for individual advancement, reinforcing a climate of dependency and frustration, even as the state projected an image of moral and social authority. The paradox of Gaddafi's social revolution lay in the tension between aspiration and implementation. While his ideological vision promised empowerment, equity, and national pride, the realities of centralized control, resource mismanagement, and bureaucratic inefficiency frequently resulted in hardship, deprivation, and resentment among the populace. Citizens were encouraged to see themselves as participants in a transformative project, yet the tangible benefits often lag behind the ambitious promises of reform, creating a dissonance between the ideals of the revolution and the daily experiences of Libyans. Nevertheless, the integration of Islamic principles into socialist policies provided a moral framework that continued to legitimize state authority and mobilize support, even as economic challenges persisted. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the cumulative effects of these policies were undeniable. While Gaddafi had succeeded in reshaping the ideological landscape of Libya and embedding his revolutionary vision into the structures of governance and society, the practical difficulties of translating lofty ideals into sustainable social and economic outcomes became increasingly apparent. Widespread poverty, mismanaged resources, and environmental strain revealed the limits of centralized authority and ideological enforcement, highlighting the inherent tension between visionary reform and operational capability. Despite these challenges, Gaddafi's approach remained consistent, with the rhetoric of social transformation continuing to guide policy decisions even as the population grappled with the complex realities of a state attempting to engineer both moral and material change. In retrospect, Gaddafi's attempt to combine socialism with Islamic principles represents a case study in the complexities of revolutionary governance, illustrating both the potential and the pitfalls of ambitious social engineering. His vision sought to unite moral, cultural, and economic imperatives into a cohesive framework for societal transformation. Yet the challenges of implementation and the consequences of centralized mismanagement demonstrate the difficulties inherent in translating ideological aspirations into effective policy. The interplay of idealism, authority, and practical limitations shaped the lived experience of Libyans for decades, leaving a legacy that is both admired and critiqued, and highlighting the profound impact of a leader whose ambitions extended far beyond the ordinary parameters of governance. As Gaddafi consolidated his domestic power, his ambitions quickly extended beyond Libya's borders, driven by a belief that his revolutionary ideology and anti-imperialist vision had relevance not just at home but across the Arab world and the broader Third World, and he saw himself as a transformative figure capable of reshaping regional and even global dynamics. With the same determination and audacity that had propelled him to overthrow King Idris, Gaddafi began to cultivate relationships and provide support to a wide range of anti-colonial movements, liberation struggles, and political leaders whose causes aligned, even loosely, with his vision of resistance to Western dominance. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, Gaddafi's Libya became a hub of financial and logistical support for movements fighting against colonial or post-colonial oppression, and he framed this involvement as both a moral duty and an extension of the revolutionary principles he had implemented at home, positioning Libya as a vanguard state that could assist the oppressed in their struggle for self-determination. One of the most prominent and enduring aspects of Gaddafi's foreign policy was his support for the Palestinian cause, a commitment rooted in his belief that Arab unity and resistance to Israeli occupation were essential to the dignity and sovereignty of the region. Gaddafi allocated substantial portions of Libya's oil wealth to support Palestinian organizations, funding education, infrastructure, and sometimes paramilitary operations, while simultaneously using these contributions to bolster his image as a pan-Arabist leader committed to the defense of Muslim and Arab populations. His rhetoric often emphasized solidarity with Palestinians, portraying their struggle as emblematic of the broader fight against imperialism and Western interference. And he sought to cultivate both public and political support for these initiatives across the Arab world. This unwavering advocacy reinforced Gaddafi's claim to regional relevance and moral authority, even as it increasingly placed Libya at odds with Western governments and neighboring states whose policies were more conciliatory toward Israel. Gaddafi's international ambitions, however, were not limited to the Arab world, as he also sought to extend influence across Africa, supporting anti-colonial movements and revolutionary leaders in nations that had recently gained independence or were struggling against lingering Western influence. From southern Africa to Central Africa, Libya became a source of funding, training, and political backing for groups challenging established regimes or colonial legacies, with Gaddafi's support often framed in ideological terms, as an effort to spread socialism, pan-Arabism, and Islamic principles as counterweights to perceived neo-colonial exploitation. Leaders who aligned with his vision received not only material assistance but also legitimacy in international forums, creating a network of relationships that enhanced Libya's stature while advancing Gaddafi's claim to leadership of a broader anti-imperialist movement. These interventions were often selective and erratic, guided by personal judgment as much as strategic calculation, reflecting Gaddafi's idiosyncratic style of diplomacy and his belief in the moral necessity of supporting revolutionary causes, even when the outcomes were uncertain or controversial. At the same time, these foreign policy activities increasingly drew the attention and condemnation of Western governments, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, which viewed Gaddafi's support for armed groups and revolutionary movements as destabilizing and, in many cases, directly linked to acts of international terrorism. Incidents such as the funding of militant organizations, the alleged involvement in airline bombings, and the backing of regimes considered hostile or rogue by the West contributed to a perception of Libya as a state sponsor of terrorism. Generating sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and periodic military confrontations. Gaddafi, however, embraced this image in many respects, framing Western criticism as further evidence of imperialist hypocrisy and using it to reinforce domestic and regional narratives of resistance, portraying himself as a defender of sovereignty and an adversary of exploitative powers. His rhetoric often combined moralizing appeals with aggressive posturing, emphasizing both the righteousness of his cause and the illegitimacy of external attempts to constrain Libya's independent foreign policy. Despite the international criticism, Gaddafi's interventions abroad had tangible effects on the political landscapes of several countries, contributing to the survival and expansion of movements that might otherwise have struggled to sustain themselves. In southern Africa, for instance, Libyan funding and training supported liberation efforts against apartheid, while in Central Africa, Libya played a role in bolstering regimes that aligned with his ideological and strategic objectives, often leaving a mixed legacy of empowerment and dependency. The emphasis on ideological alignment, combined with the irregular and sometimes unpredictable nature of Libyan support, meant that Gaddafi's interventions could produce both significant successes and unintended consequences, reflecting the complexity of using state resources to influence foreign struggles while simultaneously maintaining domestic stability. Moreover, Gaddafi's approach to international engagement was deeply personal, with relationships often shaped by his perception of loyalty, ideological commitment, and the potential for mutual benefit, rather than by formal diplomatic protocols. He maintained direct communication with leaders, negotiated personal agreements, and sometimes funded regimes or movements based on his assessment of their adherence to revolutionary principles, rather than on traditional strategic calculations. This idiosyncratic style made Gaddafi both unpredictable and influential, enabling him to punch above Libya's weight in international affairs while generating friction and distrust among traditional state actors. His interventions, while intended to demonstrate leadership and solidarity, also reinforced Libya's isolation and complicated its relations with the international community, creating a paradox in which moral ambition and strategic reality were often in tension. In sum, Gaddafi's foreign policy represented an extension of his revolutionary worldview, intertwining ideology, moral purpose, and personal ambition in a manner that sought to reshape both the Arab world and the broader post-colonial landscape. Through financial support, political backing, and rhetorical advocacy, he positioned Libya as a champion of anti-colonial movements, a defender of Palestinian rights, and a patron of aligned leaders. Yet these activities simultaneously generated widespread international condemnation, accusations of terrorism sponsorship, and long geopolitical tension. The interplay between domestic consolidation, ideological enforcement, and international activism highlights the complexity of Gaddafi's vision, demonstrating how a leader's ambition to influence both home and abroad can produce a legacy marked by both empowerment and controversy, idealism and realpolitik, moral purpose and international scrutiny, leaving Libya deeply entwined in the turbulent currents of regional and global politics. By 2011, Libya had endured more than 4 decades under the iron rule of Muammar Gaddafi, a period marked by ambitious ideology, relentless control, and repeated attempts to mold society according to his revolutionary vision. His reign had left an indelible imprint on the country. Political dissent was suppressed, economic mismanagement created persistent hardship, and foreign entanglements shaped both regional perception and international relations. Gaddafi's carefully constructed system of revolutionary committees, ideological education, and centralized control had fostered loyalty in some quarters but bred fear, frustration, and resentment in others. The cumulative weight of decades of authoritarian rule had transformed Libya into a nation both deeply influenced by his vision and profoundly constrained by the limitations of absolute power. The events of 2011 were the culmination of long-simmering tensions, inspired by the broader waves of the Arab Spring that swept across North Africa and the Middle East. Libyan citizens in cities like Benghazi, Misrata, and Tripoli began to openly protest against the regime, demanding political freedom, accountability, and an end to the systemic oppression that had defined their lives for generations. These protests quickly escalated into armed rebellion as Gaddafi's forces attempted to crush dissent through brutal military action, including aerial bombardments, mass arrests, and indiscriminate violence. The people's response reflected decades of pent-up frustration with a leader whose promises of social justice, economic equity, and Arab unity had often translated into hardship, surveillance, and fear. Neighborhoods that had once been silent witnesses to state control became active battlegrounds, and the uprising drew together a broad coalition of former technocrats, disillusioned revolutionaries, and everyday citizens united in the goal of ending the dictatorship. As the conflict intensified, Gaddafi's attempts at negotiation, including through intermediaries such as his son Saif al-Islam, proved largely ineffective. as international observers and Libyan opposition leaders doubted the sincerity of his overtures. Meanwhile, the National Transitional Council NECI emerged as a central organizing body, coordinating rebel forces, managing humanitarian needs, and providing a semblance of governance in liberated areas. The NC's ability to unify diverse factions, former government officials, armed militias, civic leaders, and ordinary citizens underscored a fundamental shift in Libyan society. After decades of centralized authoritarian control, the population was asserting its agency, seeking to reclaim power and shape the future of their nation. The final capture and death of Gaddafi marked both a symbolic and literal end to his rule. In October 2011, as loyalist forces collapsed under sustained rebel offensives, Gaddafi was captured in his hometown of Sirte. The moment was both shocking and inevitable, reflecting the irreversible consequences of decades of unchecked authority and ideological rigidity. Gaddafi's violent removal from power offered a stark lesson in the dangers of absolute rule, no matter how meticulously a regime seeks to enforce loyalty, suppress dissent, or cultivate ideological fervor. The will of the people, when combined with persistence and organization, can ultimately overcome even the most entrenched systems of power. His death was widely publicized and circulated internationally, emphasizing both the personal fate of a once dominant leader and the broader implications for Libya and similar authoritarian states. In the aftermath of Gaddafi's demise, Libya faced a complex and challenging path to reconstruction. The removal of a long-standing authoritarian figure did not instantly resolve the deep-seated political, economic, and social issues that had accumulated over decades. Transitional governance required not only stabilizing security, but also addressing the structural inequalities and systemic inefficiencies that had been entrenched under Gaddafi's rule. Efforts to establish democratic institutions, reintegrate militias into civilian life, and rebuild infrastructure demanded extensive coordination, international support, and sustained civic engagement. The legacy of Gaddafi's ideological extremism, his blend of revolutionary socialism, Arab nationalism, and Islamic rhetoric remained visible in the social and political fabric of Libya, influencing debates over governance, justice, and the role of ideology in shaping public policy. Yet amid the challenges, Gaddafi's fall also provided an opportunity for reflection, learning, and renewal. It highlighted the importance of accountability, transparency, and participatory governance as antidotes to the dangers posed by concentrated power. The international community observed closely, noting both the human cost of prolonged authoritarianism and the resilience of citizens who mobilized to reclaim their nation. Scholars, journalists, and policymakers have since studied Libya's experience as a case study in the limits of centralized ideology and the unpredictable consequences of mixing personal ambition with state power. While the country's post-Gaddafi trajectory has been uneven, the fundamental lesson remains clear. Enduring political systems require legitimacy rooted in consent, inclusion, and the rule of law, rather than fear, coercion, or the unchallenged authority of a single individual. As we conclude this story, it is worth remembering that history offers not only narratives of power and downfall but also lessons that transcend specific times and places. Gaddafi's rise and fall underscore the complexities of leadership, the seductive allure of ideology, and the tangible consequences of decisions that affect millions of lives. For viewers reflecting on this journey, the story of Libya under Gaddafi invites us to consider the balance between vision and pragmatism, the costs of extremism, and the enduring strength of collective action in shaping society. It serves as a reminder that leaders are accountable not only to their ideas, but ultimately to the people whose lives they touch. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this detailed account of Muammar Gaddafi's rule and its impact on Libya and the world. If you found this story insightful and engaging, Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future explorations of history, power, and leadership. Your support allows us to continue creating in-depth and thought-provoking content. And now, wishing you a restful night and sweet dreams. Good night.